sky. That's the masses inside.
Welcome back to another episode of Give Me Some Truth International Edition. Dame la verdad, as it's also known. Dígame la verdad as well. Yesterday I had a strange experience that I hope will tie into why we're doing this podcast. I discovered I had a suit in my closet.
Wow, that is
yeah.
a strange experience.
Yeah.
I've never seen it.
Well, you know, we're not a suit-based office. I think we've established that.
Is it lime green or pink?
It is a classic navy blue suit.
Yeah.
It's from a classic American menswear brand, J Press. It's a 3-roll 2 flat front trouser. The problem is I have no recollection of buying it. And so I'm a little worried about how old I'm getting. But it also called to mind that I have no recollection of us ever recording a podcast about the banking issues that Americans abroad face, which is something that we talk to our clients all about all the time. You know, we've talked a little bit in white papers and elsewhere in blogs about why it's so difficult for Americans to open accounts, brokerage accounts while abroad, but we haven't talked much about banking specifically, and it's something that people ask us about all the time and that sort of thing. And I think there are kind of two parts to the banking conversation, big picture, and within those kind of two parts within both of those. The two parts are, okay, opening bank accounts in your country of residence as an American expat. So can I open a French bank account in France? Can I open a German bank account in Germany? Can I open up and so that's one sort of set of issues.
So we're going to dedicate 1 hour to each of these two parts, right?
If we set you loose, we might.
No.
And then problems maintaining American bank accounts while living abroad become the other one.
Yeah.
And so one thing, that we'll look at, and a lot of what we're going to say is going to apply to Western Europe, because in certain cases, there are local rules where Americans can't open local bank accounts in, certain parts of the world. But for the most part, not the case in a lot of the countries we deal with, UK, France, Spain, Germany. So if you're moving to one of Portugal,
Sweden.
you're moving to Sweden, if you're moving to one of those countries, you won't have an issue. Certain other jurisdictions, you might. So just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind. And then the other sort of side of things is, in both of these cases, what's the current structure? What are the solutions? What's the history? So, to start with, if I'm an American moving abroad, what do I need to know about opening a bank account in the country of residence that I'm moving to?
One thing I would mention is, and this is feedback that we get from a lot of expats is, oh, I went to this bank or that bank, and they won't open an account for me as an American. And that's going to happen, right? It's just a fact of life that some banks outside the U.S. will have policies that will, be completely binary, and it's, if you're American, we can't work with you, right? It's a hard and fast rule. It's not a law that they can't work with you. It's just a decision that they've made. So,
And why have they made that decision so largely?
You tell me.
Well, I think this is the case where the history comes into play, right? And so the number one thing you hear all the time is FATCA. It's FATCA's fault. And it's not, it is and it isn't, right?
He did it. He brought up FATCA.
Yeah. So the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. Now, the first misconception of FATCA is that it's something that applies to individuals. It is not, right? FATCA applies to financial institutions. So if somebody tells you they can't open an account because of FATCA, the reason is, particularly in Europe, for smaller banks, the cost of complying with FATCA is generally such that they'd rather not deal with Americans.
Right. So costs, complexity, perceived risk of non-compliance, individual banks can make their own decisions, and sometimes it's just simpler to have this hard and fast rule. We won't work with you if you're an American. Now, what I would say is it's case by case, right? And in our experience, most Americans abroad manage to find a way to establish at least one banking relationship that they can rely on to get a checking account, maybe a basic savings account in their country of residence.
Right.
So the only difference is, there might be a little bit more work involved, and you may not have, 50 different options like most local residents would. Maybe you have 2 options, right? So you need to kind of know your way around the local banking landscape. Find that Facebook group where you can get the information about what bank allows Americans. And in most cases, people are successful in finding what they need.
And in certain cases as well, and this is from my personal experience, this predates even FATCA. I was going to say predates COVID. Predates FATCA, is that certain branches of banks will be the ones that will deal with non-Americans. So I remember when I was in Paris, there was a specific branch of the big bank in France. We're not going to give free promotion to French banks. But, there was a specific branch where they worked with foreigners. And the, local, you couldn't just walk down the street to your local branch and open up an account as you might if you were French. You had to go to a specific branch. So these complexities have always been there. The options have shrunk. But generally, my sense is in the countries we work with, if you go to a major bank, the country's biggest bank, you can't go to, the equivalent of a credit union necessarily, but if you go to a major bank, they will likely open an account for you.
Right. I liken this to the American brokerage dilemma for expats. Most American brokerages don't want to spend the money that is required to kind of navigate international waters, right? They're worried about the downside outweighing the upside because of the number of clients that they have that are going to move overseas. It's better to just not go there. But because most don't go there, Schwab, being deep pockets that it is, said, "Hey, this is low-hanging fruit for us because nobody else is servicing these clients, and we're going to go. We're the juice is worth the squeeze here. We're going to do it, right?" So there's
My
always
least favorite of Stan's expressions.
every country, is going to have banks that just decide, okay, well, we don't have enough Americans for this to be financially viable.
Right.
But if none of the other banks, are taking care of Americans that live in that country and want to bank there, somebody's going to fill that void.
Well, and as well, part of it too is,
more than
with FATCA, just to, it involves basically money, reporting on American accounts there and money going through. And so one of the things as well is, it affects retail clients, but generally they're going to have FATCA compliance if they work with large international businesses because they know they're going to have to worry about, American rules and regulations around those accounts. So I think that changes it. One of the things as well to kind of keep in mind, and I think this segues into the sort of second part, is why is it so difficult to keep my bank account in the U.S. if I move across, is FATCA doesn't affect American banks. A lot of people get confused about that. What does affect American banks, and I think also affects a lot of American brokerages, are what are referred to as know your client rules, right?
Yes.
And so American banks face a structure, rules passed in the wake of the September 11th attacks related to the Patriot Act that say, in order to protect against money laundering, banks have a higher standard that they need to uphold in order to regulate their clients and observe their clients and so on. Brokerages independently are not subject to that, right? So that there's a split between brokerages and banks. But what happened in 2008, 2009, kind of concurrent with FATCA, we had this big economic crisis, and a lot of brokerages ended up being bought by banks, and the lawyers looked at it and went, ooh, our brokerage accounts, we're going to need to have the same level of KYC.
Yeah, so there's a lot of compliance, a lot of complexity, and anyone who's involved in money movement, you're right. There's a heightened level of scrutiny in terms of compliance, and it's true. A lot of U.S. banks just decide not to bother, right? And that's what it comes down to. There's nothing fundamentally illegal about a U.S. bank working with an American abroad. It's just to decide that dealing with foreign residents is more trouble than is worth.
And it's in some senses rather silly because if you're an American abroad and you're working with an American bank, you have a Social Security number. Mm-hmm. You have, the mandatory reporting to the U.S. government. All of the things that FATCA were meant to, cover are all there, right? And so it's a case where, the banks just kind of went, oh, red flags, let's throw up our hands, run away. But, for Americans, all the kind of reporting and all of that stuff is happening automatically to the U.S. government. They just look at that foreign address and, an American in one of the unique things about the United States is American living in France, living in Spain, living in Timbuktu is treated to the same tax rules but the banks saw know your client and foreign address and they just went, oop, red flags.
Absolutely.
Money laundering, problems. And so that's what happens. So what are, the solutions for you as an American if you're moving abroad? The first thing is to check with your banks. Banks are always changing policies. They may have an international division. Certain big multinational banks have offices overseas still work with clients overseas. Certain banks, part of the reason they have their, current reputation is that was their specialty, working, with overseas clients. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind is that your bank may not.
Of course, if you call an 800 number and ask somebody at the bank, you might, call three times, you might get three different answers.
That's the big problem that
I don't know.
Yeah, many Americans face is trying to find the right person to talk to.
Right.
Yeah.
And so find out if your bank has an international division and then go there. If you just walk up to your local teller, they're going to go, I don't think so. I think we, or yeah, sure, that's great. You have to find the right division because a lot of these decisions are made on a case-by-case basis as well. How much do you have in assets? Where are you moving? So on and so forth.
Right.
And so that's something that you need to keep in mind. The other thing is explore. There are certain banks here in the United States through organizations as well that represent Americans abroad that will maintain a U.S. bank account for you if you're living abroad. One thing to keep in mind is that those relationships are not always exactly like they are in the United States. So you may not get like automatic bill pay set up. You may not get, some of those services that you're accustomed to. But, if you plan ahead and think through it, there are ways of working through that, right? So that you can maintain that. So like it may not be automatic bill pay. You may have to go in and put in, the debit card that this bank issues you for your bill pay rather than the, direct debit that they were doing. So there are some things in that manner that, will change. So that's something to kind of keep in mind as you're thinking about these things. But yeah, finding a specialist, finding someone. The other thing is something that we do for our clients with Charles Schwab, right, where you can essentially have a bank account. Right?
Yeah. I think, if you have a brokerage account, brokers in the U.S. have gotten really good at offering, checking account-like solutions.
In an
Right.
ordinary brokerage account.
In an ordinary brokerage
Yes.
account, you can have a checkbook, a debit card. So that could be an alternative to a banking relationship for a lot of people. And so if the bank side, a true bank, doesn't work, see if you can just do the same thing through your broker, right? And like you said, we do this all the time for our clients, and it's worth looking into.
Yeah, what Keith said about the banks having different regulations than the brokerages, Schwab is a great example because Schwab has both, right? There's Charles Schwab and Company brokerage, and then there's Schwab Bank, right?
But they're separate
But
firms.
they are separate entities. So if you're a Wisconsin resident and you have a Schwab account, you can have a Schwab Bank high interest checking account, they call it, right, attached to your brokerage account. But if you move overseas, that bank account goes away, right? No matter where you move, right? If you've got an overseas address, Schwab Bank doesn't want to deal with you anymore. But that Schwab brokerage account will allow you to put on you can have a debit card that works at ATMs all across the world. You can have checks printed out and shipped off to you, and you can pretty much carry out most of the features that you would be able to do with that Schwab bank account with the brokerage.
You can wire
checking
money
features.
out to your local bank account in whatever country
Indeed.
you live. One other thing that I think people get confused about as well is your address is not your tax documents, right, in some sense. So what we see as well is a lot of people will be moving outside of the United States for 9 months a year. Maybe you go to somewhere warm for 8 months a year and then come back to Wisconsin, and you still have a residence in Wisconsin for 4 months a year. There's really no need in that case, if you have another abode, to change everything. Even though you might be out of the country for 8 months, it's not going to affect your taxes as long as you're reporting everything properly to the United States government. So you don't need to worry, oh my gosh, I'm living in this country for 8 months a year. I'm technically a tax resident there. Do I need to change my accounts? In those cases, no, you don't really. You can keep that address if you're, the sort of person that has a fixed abode in the United States. And so, one of the, things that we spend a lot of time on is dispelling myths and rumors that people have heard from the internet, right? And confusions and people read one story where people omit, lots and lots of details, and they're like, oh, don't do this. Makes you a tax criminal. And it's like, well, actually what made you the tax criminal is you failed to report all of your foreign bank accounts during that period.
Right.
It's not that
Is that frowned upon?
It's not encouraged, Stan. So remember as well, your address is not your tax reporting, and your local jurisdiction is going to have requirements. If you have a local bank account and it exceeds, the limits, the FinCEN 114 limits, which I believe are still 10,000. They haven't.
Yep.
They haven't adjusted.
They're not
those.
inflation
still the same.
adjusted.
Yep.
And it's $10,000 in aggregate, right? So
Yep.
if it's $6,000 in two accounts, you have to report.
Yep, and whether it's in if it's got a U.S. address or a French address, that doesn't matter. You have to report it on your FinCEN 114. So addresses are not tax, right? So you may be like, well, I live in the United States, 7 months a year, but you have a French bank account for your French house, and you're there only 5 months a year. Doesn't matter. You still need to report that French bank account if it's over 10,000 USD.
Sure.
And so that's one of the other kind of confusions that people get into on this topic. So remember, you got to report those foreign bank accounts, even if you're, say, one where I think it probably pops up quite a bit, maybe not U.S. and France or U.S. and Japan, but Canadians, right? If you have bank accounts here in the United States and you have a Canadian bank account, make sure you're filing that FinCEN 114, even if you don't, aren't a Canadian tax resident. So those are some of the, sort of items to kind of keep in the back of your mind. Anything else that people should bear in mind on this topic as we kind of close things up?
Yeah, I would add that there is there's a credit union that services the State Department, right?
Mhm.
That is a really great fallback. So if you move abroad and you don't necessarily even have to do anything. I agree with that. In an ideal world, you contact your bank, you get in touch with the international department, you get some idea of what's going to happen. But the fact of the matter is, I've got clients that have been kicked out of Wells Fargo, and I've got clients in the same country that still have their Wells Fargo accounts. I don't see a consistency about these things sometimes. So in my experience, just know that there's a fallback with the federal, what is it called? The
State Department
Federal Credit Union. Thank you.
One of the, I think it's the American Association of Residents Overseas, or American
Citizens Abroad.
American Citizens Abroad. If you're a member of that group, that will get you membership
into the credit union.
Union. And there are other ways of being a State Department Federal Credit Union member, including there's a Consumer Protection Agency as well. And you just need that membership to open up the account. You don't need to maintain it for the rest of your life. And that will allow you into the credit union, though I do think ACA and AARO, for that matter, do good work. They also provide good resources and are, I would say, in a morass of, half-truths and, one stories. They're a good, consistent source of information for Americans abroad.
Yeah.
So both of those organizations we do endorse, and we do, like the State Department Federal Credit Union, if you want a true bank account and don't want to have that kind of hybrid brokerage account.
And just a matter of my own personal observation through, all of the different clients that I've worked with, it does seem to me that credit unions are different than banks.
Yeah,
right? I seem to have an inordinate amount of clients that still do their banking in the U.S. through like their university credit union or things like that. So it may actually be a case where smaller is better.
Well,
if you're looking to keep a banking relationship.
In the U.S., credit unions are regulated slightly different than banks, right? So, some of these, rules, but also they're smaller. They're, they know, a lot of times your credit union knows who you are.
Yeah.
And so it works just fine. Yeah. In certain cases, smaller banks are fine with it because they've known you your whole life, and, you're moving abroad and they're good with it. Right. So again, case by case in the U.S., but there are options and backups for you. So we thank you for, and one thing I like to remind people still, as you can probably attest, it's no easier for, people moving here from abroad to open up an account in the U.S., right? It's a lot of paperwork and a lot of double checking, even if you're a U.S. resident as a foreign citizen.
Yeah, it's always weird, and also like getting your first credit card, for people moving to the U.S. is always a challenge. So even that, making the move in the opposite direction, people moving to the U.S., that has its own set of challenges, and but ultimately for most of our clients, it still makes sense to try to keep some sort of banking relationship in the U.S. And there's one thing kind of unique about the U.S. is, we still use checks here.
No one does that, yes.
If you've been living abroad, you've realized that the rest of the world no longer does. But it could be that one day someone's going to want to send you a check, or you're going to need to send a check to someone. For that reason alone, you might still need that U.S. banking relationship.
Well, and one thing that technology has made better is that you can use your phone if you're living abroad if you get that check. Although fraud now in the United States, like I think the check that most people get is that one from the U.S. government, either, one of the stimulus checks, and they get that one. And because of fraud, I couldn't mobile deposit mine. I had to take it into my branch, which is, just crazy. But So I guess the lesson we're trying to tell you is banking should be simpler in the United States, but it's not. So anyway, before we get ourselves into trouble and really start complaining.
We already did.
Okay. Okay, good.
We're good.
Thanks for listening. And if you have questions about any of these topics, feel free to reach out to us. Feel free to comment on the YouTube page. Remember as well, and I think we should, probably put this in going forward, we can't offer, specialized guidance and advice in our comments on the YouTube page itself, just because of, a variety of regulations that we're subject to. So hopefully this gets you on the right path and gives you some suggestions, but we can't answer for individual banks, et cetera, et cetera. So
yeah,
thanks
and
again.
it's very well worth mentioning that when we, talk about specific firms, mention them. We're not affiliated with them. We have no connection to them, and we're not making representation on behalf of any,
That's right.
companies other than Walkner Condon.
We keep our indie edge. We're
Well,
beholden to no
and
one.
we can't endorse it, and policies are always changing. Yeah. So you may, be at a certain.
It's starting to sound like a legal podcast.
It is.
Well,
Come on, guys.
but that's one of the things that's often frustrating for people is one person gives them one answer and another gives another. So, we know it's difficult. Hopefully we provided you with some guidance on navigating it. So thanks again for listening, and have a good rest of your week.
Walkner Condon Financial Advisors is a registered investment advisor with the SEC. Registration with the SEC does not imply a certain level of skill or training. The opinions expressed by the participants of this podcast are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Walkner Condon Financial Advisors. All statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. Information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Viewers are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance.
You gotta leave your money behind you. Raise your hand to the sky. Ask the masses for silence.